Hi, everyone. So while they're advancing the slides, I just wanted to say thank you to Todd and to the All Things Open team. It was about 12 years ago, I think, that Guy Martin and I came to do our talk here at All Things Open. And I fell in love with the city of Raleigh. And so my husband and I moved to Raleigh in 2019 from Northern California. And we've just loved being here, and this is our home. Our daughter is going to school here, and it's just been a wonderful place to be. So the third decade of open source, and Christine is right in front, and I hope she'll correct me and make sure that I get this right. The clicker? Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay. It's important to talk about the third decade. I think Matt just talked about the era that we are in. And before we go into the third decade, it's important for us to understand where we came from. What was the origin of open source, and how did it start, and how did we all bring it to this point? And what are the challenges that we face in the third decade? I think this morning's keynotes have been pretty sobering, so I'll continue along the same path. What happened in the first decade? I would characterize it by the book, A Tale of Two Cities. And the two cities were Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Helsinki, Finland. And Cambridge in the 80s was the home to Richard Stallman, who was a researcher at Cambridge, who said, this just doesn't work, not having access to the code, not having the ability to change the code, not having the freedom as a consumer to examine the code and make it work for him. And he is the one who created the GPL license, the GNU public license, which became known, if you will, for the 4 freedoms of open source. And that became the important driver for the free software movement. And then in the 90s, there was a young student in the University of Helsinki, Finland, who said, hey, I can't afford to buy, a proprietary computer, and I'd like to create my own kernel. And he did, and he used the GPL license to share his code with everybody. And frankly, the use of that code opened up a whole world of collaboration and whole world of interest, to the point where Linux is now the default operating system in the world. Very soon, foundations followed, and then you have the ASF established in the 90s to rally around HTTP, and the Apache, web server, and other projects. And then the Linux Foundation was also created around 2000 to create a nonprofit and a neutral home, if you will, for companies to collaborate on open source and to work together to create and protect open source, which was really a fledgling idea in those days, from legal threat, from governance, funding, and other financial threats. That was the time I was working at SGI, and I think a number of us who worked for IBM, Sun, HP, really were the first ones to really start working on shipping open source-based servers to customers and making open source safe for companies to use, and open source became the kind of the default, if you will, in data centers and IT. And I want to shout out to Dave McAllister. Dave was my mentor at SGI in 1998, and the person who got me started on my open source journey. Oh, I should not forget that it was also a heady time from a financial markets and establishment of companies perspective. Who remembers VA Linux? Right? So VA Linux was created in those days, and also Red Hat was IPO'd in those days. So there was a ton of activity happening in the early days, if you will, of open source. And then there was this whole conversation around, should it be free? Should it be open? Christine Peterson was really credited with coming up with the term open source, because a lot of us company types were kind of squeamish about the term free. We thought it was economic freedom and that it was giving things away free, and it wasn't something that sat comfortably with a lot of companies. So the word open source was coined, and that's the symbol of the OSI, which has stood behind the open source definition and worked hard to protect the definition of open source. Okay, so that leads us into the second decade. So we have all these initial foundations, if you will, for open source. In the second decade, you find that open source is now just flourishing. Web-scale companies are building entire data centers based on open source. You have the Googles and the Facebooks and Amazon and Netflix and others using open source to build massive data centers, commodity hardware, Linux software, and the LAMP stack, and so on and so forth. And that would not have been possible if, Linux hadn't come to that stage of acceptance and maturity. And then you even have mobile operating systems such as Android, and then you have IoT operating systems like Zephyr and Yocto. I personally got to work on the Yocto project, and that was one of the highlights of my open source career. And Christine will say, yet there's no desktop, but the mobile phone has become the desktop today, right? So Linux is on the desktop in some way. And then even enterprises like banks and grocery stores and e-commerce companies like Amazon and so also Comcast, where I worked before, start using open source. So it becomes, and banks are saying, we are tech companies. We are not financial services companies. We're tech companies first, and then we serve, financial services customers. So it's become ubiquitous by now. Even governments start digitizing and using technology to serve their citizens and their industries and their company and their employees. And the United Nations very recently published their principles of their UN open source principles. And I think that's amazing. Please go check it out. And many, many companies and organizations have adopted those principles. That is a big deal when the UN stands behind it, and there's a whole lot of work going around in the world on digital public goods and using open source. So what does that mean? Open source now is supporting the world's most critical infrastructure, from government infrastructure, defense, to electrical grids, to enterprises, to banking, to networking. It is the underpinning of the most critical infrastructure in the world. And that's the city of Raleigh, I think at dawn, and the beautiful greenery, a summer picture of the city of Raleigh. Okay, so that brings us to the third decade, and as you can imagine, with ubiquity and with being the underpinning of such critical infrastructure comes a lot of responsibility, and comes a lot of scrutiny. So that's one of the challenges of the third decade, in my mind, is security. And there is a very fragile supply chain, if you will, in open source. You have thousands of volunteers you're depending upon who may or may not have security training, who do not have responsibility towards you as a user to provide secure patches or keep it secure or maintained. And then there's the sustainability of these projects. Many maintainers are burning out. They don't have enough funding. They don't have enough support. And so you have this situation of a lot of dependency on a lot of different projects, a very fragile supply chain, not knowing what's pulled into your dependencies. And so it's really up to all of us to continue to focus on security, being more proactive, from a security perspective, making sure we track and keep track of what is in our software. And regulations like the CRA, which is the Cyber Resilience Act, are really forcing this conversation to the point where it's saying, if you are a manufacturer, if you are supplying goods to Europe, you need to know what's in your software, You need to stand behind your software. You need to provide guidance on any critical errors or CVEs in your software, and you need to fix it. So I think it's forcing the conversation for manufacturers to own more of the supply chain conversation, if you will. The next conversation I think that we all have to have in this third decade is sustainability. It's, again, a very fragile financial picture, if you will. From projects not having enough financial support to very intermittent support, depending upon donors, depending upon GitHub sponsors and credits and things of that nature, to foundations struggling to stay alive and support the work that they're doing, to companies, frankly, only focusing on what they depend upon and not finding the time to broadly support what needs to be there, and government funds drying up, grants, et cetera. It's a very fragile picture right now from a funding perspective, and we need to really get together as a community and look at how we fund open source in a more sustainable and consistent way, so that we're not always looking for doles and grants and so on and so forth. Sovereign fund, the German sovereign fund, is one example of country putting aside money to support open source. And then companies are also putting aside funds like the Alpha Omega Fund, for example, to support security in open source. But these are all just one-offs. We really need a more consistent funding model in open source. Matt covered a lot of issues in open source AI. So all I'll say is we need to be front and center in open source AI. We as a community need to demand transparency. We need to governance. We need to make sure it's ethical, bias-free, and we have an opportunity to do that. We need open source models. We need open source data. We need open science, and we need open standards. And we, as a community, can do something about it. I think many countries in the world are really concerned that there are only 2 or 3 suppliers, if you will, of models, and their cultures are not represented, their languages are not represented in these models. It is just cultures of 2, maybe, the West and China, maybe. And so it's important to provide more open source models that countries can use, cultures can use to make their own. The last one I'll say, and Jim mentioned this as well, we're all aging. If you look around the room, a lot of us in open source are, have been here for decades, and we're probably going to retire or move on, and we really need to do a good job of building the pipeline of leadership, pipeline of the next generation of open source people, developers, leaders, et cetera. A lot of us young people that I talk to take open source for granted. It's just there, and it's part of their stacks, and they don't know what the license is, they don't know where it came from, what the ethos, what the culture of open source is, and it's so important for each of us to adopt or spend time with younger people, share the stories, share the culture, share the history, so that we have the next generation carrying forward the burden and the opportunity that we have in open source. Because open source, my friends, is one of the most successful enablers of global innovation in history. And we need to sustain this open innovation as we move into AI. So please join all of us, Jim, myself, Todd, others, in helping someone learn about the history of open source and get involved in open source and make sure we continue to keep it open. Thank you.